disabled veteran, was denied coffee. Next morning, Navy SEALs lined the parking lot. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The sky was already gray when Frank Dalton stepped outside. Not storm gray, not the kind that boomed with warning, just the low, dull haze of a Tuesday that had nothing good to offer. Rain misted gently, the kind that soaked through your jacket before you even knew it had started. But Frank didn't reach for an umbrella. He never had. He simply adjusted the cap on his head. U.S. Army Special Forces now faded to a dull olive and began the same walk he had taken for the last 14 years. 2 miles. Exactly. From his weather trailer at the edge of town to May's Diner on Main Street. Rain or shine, summer or snow. It wasn't about the coffee. It never had been. It was about ritual, about walking the same cracked sidewalks past the same tired storefronts, about being seen, even if unnoticed. Frank's left leg, lost to an IED just north of Tikrit in 2006, had been replaced with a polished titanium prosthetic. It clicked softly beneath his jeans with each step, left, right, left, like a metronome only he could hear. It hurt sometimes, especially in the rain, but he never let it change the rhythm. Along the way, he stopped as he always did, picked up 2 fast food cups flattened against the curb, nudged a tipped-over trash bin back upright, gave a gentle nod to the teenage boy sitting on his front stoop with his hoodie pulled low. The boy didn't respond, but Frank didn't expect him to. He never asked for much. By the time he reached May's Diner, the mist had thickened to a steady drizzle, beating on the window panes and trailing down like tears. Frank wiped his boots at the door and stepped inside, greeted not by words but by the familiar warmth of coffee and bacon grease and a jukebox stuck playing old Patsy Cline. The bell above the door jingled, soft and familiar. A few heads turned. Old Charlie at the counter gave him the faintest nod. Mrs. Jenkins looked up from her crossword, but said nothing. That was okay. Frank didn't need conversation. He just needed his booth by the window. Third one from the left. But today something was off. Behind the counter stood a new waitress. Young, blonde, her hair in a high, too neat ponytail. Her eyes scanned him the moment he stepped inside, and Frank felt it. The flicker of appraisal, the narrowing of suspicion. He made his way toward his usual spot, nodding slightly as he passed her. She didn't smile, didn't greet him. Instead, her gaze dropped, first to his soaked coat, then to the worn patch on his sleeve, and finally to the slight metallic glint just visible beneath the cuff of his jeans. Then she said it. We don't serve people like you. The room didn't freeze. It did something worse. It sank. Chairs scraped. Forks paused midair. Conversations stumbled into silence. No one gasped. No one stood. They just looked away. Frank stopped mid-step. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. I only wanted a cup of coffee, he said, voice low, without anger. Just fact. Her arms crossed. You'll have to leave. He nodded once. No protest. No speech. No demand to speak with a manager. Frank just reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a crumpled $5 bill, and placed it carefully on the counter beside the register. The diner was so quiet, the paper seemed to echo. He turned without another word. Outside, the rain had thickened. A snicker rose from a booth in the back. One of the high schoolers. Frank didn't turn. He just pushed open the door, stepped out, and let it shut softly behind him. Back on the sidewalk, the drizzle turned to steady rain. Frank didn't rush. He never did. The walk home was slower now, not from pain, but from weight, the kind that settles deep in the ribs and doesn't show on x-rays. He passed the church with the crooked cross, the barber shop with the same broken neon sign. No one noticed him. Not really. And yet, this street, this town, this country, he'd carried it once. In places where carrying it nearly broke him. Near the corner of 5th and Maple, a group of teenagers zipped past on skateboards, their laughter too loud, too sharp. One cut too close. Move it, old man, he laughed, not even looking back. Frank stopped by the lamppost, rested a hand on the cool metal to steady himself. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly and looked back through the fogged windows of the diner. People were laughing again, eating pancakes, checking phones. living the life he and men like him had made possible. Back at the trailer, the silence greeted him like an old friend. He removed his coat, hung it on the same hook by the door, and washed his hands at the kitchen sink. An automatic motion drilled into him from years of field hospitals and fire bases. Then he sat at the table. On the wall was a single photograph, 10 men, dusty and sunburned, standing shoulder to shoulder. In front of a Humvee, their eyes, even then, said more than their mouths ever could. 4 of those men were gone now. 3 hadn't made it home. 2 were in VA hospitals. 1 lived down in Texas and sent a Christmas card every year. Frank opened a worn leather-bound journal and turned to a blank page. Tuesday, October 17th. Turned away from May's Diner. No explanation. No one stood up, just told to leave. His handwriting trembled slightly, but each line was neat, precise, like the man himself. He didn't post it online, didn't call a lawyer, didn't even tell his neighbor. He just wrote it down. That was enough. For now. Outside, the rain came harder. A stray cat, black and ragged, squeezed in through the cracked screen door and padded over to sit at his feet. "Evenin', Captain," Frank murmured, reaching down to scratch behind its ears. The name wasn't random. It belonged to a man Frank once followed into places maps didn't name. A man who died whispering coordinates into a busted radio so the rest could live. Frank turned the dial on his old radio. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of Operation Sentinel, in which U.S. Special Forces. Click. The radio went silent. "That chapter doesn't need retelling," Frank said softly. That night, a message arrived. His phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. He never answered those. But for some reason, this time, he checked. Report received. Stand by. Frank frowned. He hadn't reported anything. Had he? The next morning, before dawn, something changed. But that's not this part of the story. Not yet. Right now, in the stillness of that rain-laced evening, a man who had once trained warriors to breach walls and walk through hell sat quietly in a dim trailer with a journal in one hand and a sleeping cat in the other. And somewhere, far away, someone was reading that 5-word message and preparing a response that would shake a town, lift the silence, and remind everyone that some heroes never stop serving. By 5:30 a.m., Frank Dalton was already up. He didn't use an alarm. He hadn't needed one since Vietnam. His body still woke like it was waiting for a distant mortar. The morning routine was exact. Wash face, shave with hot water from the kettle, fold the same flannel shirt over his prosthetic limb with practiced precision, and pour exactly 2 scoops of Maxwell House into the old tin percolator on the stove. The cat, Captain, rubbed against his ankle, tail twitching like a metronome. Frank dropped a few pieces of dry kibble into a chipped bowl, then filled a saucer with water. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. Outside, the sky was still ink-dark, the town not yet stirring. Frank opened his front door and stepped into his rhythm. Wednesdays were for the VFW. Frank didn't go there to talk much. He mostly worked in the back, keeping the flagpole straight, refilling the coffee urn, fixing the broken chairs people leaned too far back on. Other vets, some younger, some older, came and went. Some carried their stories like they carried their oxygen tanks. Others, like Frank, left the past folded in a drawer. There was a teenage boy who'd started showing up, rough around the edges, smelled of smoke, and wore headphones like armor. Nobody knew much about him, but Frank recognized the walk, the limp that wasn't physical, the look in the eyes that said, "Don't expect anything from me." Frank didn't ask his name, just slid an extra donut his way every week. "You ever use a table saw?" Frank asked one Wednesday, breaking their silence. The kid shrugged. "Not really." Frank didn't nod, didn't smile, just motioned toward the back room. "Come on, let's fix that busted leg on the trophy case." They didn't talk after that, but the kid came back the next week. And the next. Thursdays were for repairs. Frank's hands weren't what they used to be, but they remembered. Carburetors, timing belts, brake pads. His fingers moved over them like a pianist over ivory. He never charged, just left a note, oiled and tightened. Should hold for a few more months. FD. People tried to thank him. Some left pies. Others left cash in envelopes taped to his door. He always returned the money, kept the pies. He'd repaired the Hendersons' furnace last winter in the middle of a power outage. Crawled through their crawl space with a flashlight and a prayer. No one saw him come or go. They just woke up warm. Fridays, Frank mowed the lawn at the corner house. Mrs. Abrams was 87, half blind, and her knees were shot. She still thought her husband was coming home from the war. Every Friday morning, she put out lemonade on the porch and a small American flag in the planter by the steps. Frank mowed while she napped. She never saw him. He never needed her to. Sundays were hardest. Frank visited the cemetery. He didn't bring flowers. He trimmed the hedges, polished the brass on the old plaques, and righted any flags that had fallen over. He did it before the sun rose, before families arrived in their Sunday best. He always paused the longest at the same headstone. SGT, Alan Reeves. Kia Mosul, 2005. The man had died pulling Frank out of a burning Humvee. Frank had written his mother every Christmas since. Never told her why. At night, Frank returned home, poured one mug of tea, and sat in the same chair by the window. He turned on the AM radio, volume low. News, weather, occasionally a baseball game out of Cincinnati. Sometimes he'd stare at the bookshelf, where one photo frame stood alone, 10 men in dusty camo, all squinting into a desert sun. 4 of those men were gone now. 3 were missing. 1 lived in New Mexico and sent strange postcards with no return address. Beside the photo sat a shoebox. Inside, 2 purple hearts, a bronze star, and a medal he'd never explained. There was a letter, too, framed but face down, signed by a president whose name was always followed by division. Frank didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. He lived his service quietly. On the night after the diner incident, Frank added a new entry to his journal. Didn't go back. Don't plan to. Didn't sleep well. Not because of what she said. Because of what no one said. Captain curled at his feet, purring like a machine left running. Outside, wind whispered through the pines. Rain ticked against the trailer roof like small reminders. He closed the journal and stared out the window. You still with me, Captain? He asked, not looking down. The cat flicked its tail. Elsewhere in town, a different kind of conversation was beginning. At the VFW, a younger vet had overheard a diner worker bragging about kicking some bum vet out. The description, flannel shirt, limp, army cap, fit only one man. Phone calls followed. In basements and garages, across folding tables and back porches, the question passed from mouth to mouth. They said, what if Frank Dalton? And quietly, like wind through long grass, something began to shift. The next Monday, a letter arrived in Frank's mailbox. It wasn't from a person. It was from a place, a private security firm in Virginia. The letterhead read, Black Ridge Defense Group. The message was short. Mr. Dalton, we've been made aware of a recent incident. Please know your name still carries weight. More importantly, your example carries more. Respectfully, Dr. There was no return address. Frank read it once. Then again. He folded it and placed it under the shoebox, where a few other such letters rested like pressed leaves. That Friday, Frank woke before dawn. He trimmed Mrs. Abrams' hedges a little shorter, left the lemonade untouched. He stopped by the high school woodshop, fixed the wobble in the third lathe, left without speaking to anyone. He walked by the church, picked up 2 overturned trash bins, and nodded at the janitor who always waved. This time, the janitor stepped forward. Hey, Frank, he said, voice tight. Heard what happened? I wasn't there, but if I had been, Frank didn't make him finish. He just gave a gentle nod and kept walking. That night, he opened his journal again. People noticing, not asking questions, just noticing. He paused, then added one more line. Still walking. Outside, a black SUV passed slowly down the road. Unmarked. Quiet. It didn't stop, but Frank saw it and nodded. Somewhere out beyond this small town, a ripple had started. And soon, the world would remember what one quiet man could still represent, just by keeping his rhythm. By 5:30 a.m., Frank Dalton was already up. He didn't use an alarm. He hadn't needed one since Vietnam. His body still woke like it was waiting for a distant mortar. The morning routine was exact. Wash face, shave with hot water from the kettle, fold the same flannel shirt over his prosthetic limb with practiced precision, and pour exactly 2 scoops of Maxwell House into the old tin percolator on the stove. The cat, Captain, rubbed against his ankle, tail twitching like a metronome. Frank dropped a few pieces of dry kibble into a chipped bowl, then filled a saucer with water. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. Outside, the sky was still ink-dark, the town not yet stirring. Frank opened his front door and stepped into his rhythm. Wednesdays were for the VFW. Frank didn't go there to talk much. He mostly worked in the back, keeping the flagpole straight, refilling the coffee urn, fixing the broken chairs people leaned too far back on. Other vets, some younger, some older, came and went. Some carried their stories like they carried their oxygen tanks. Others, like Frank, left the past folded in a drawer. There was a teenage boy who'd started showing up, rough around the edges, smelled of smoke, and wore headphones like armor. Nobody knew much about him, but Frank recognized the walk, the limp that wasn't physical, the look in the eyes that said, "Don't expect anything from me." Frank didn't ask his name, just slid an extra donut his way every week. "You ever use a table saw?" Frank asked one Wednesday, breaking their silence. The kid shrugged. "Not really." Frank didn't nod, didn't smile, just motioned toward the back room. "Come on, let's fix that busted leg on the trophy case." They didn't talk after that, but the kid came back the next week, and the next. Thursdays were for repairs. Frank's hands weren't what they used to be, but they remembered. Carburetors, timing belts, brake pads. His fingers moved over them like a pianist over ivory. He never charged, just left a note, oiled and tightened. Should hold for a few more months. FD. People tried to thank him. Some left pies. Others left cash in envelopes taped to his door. He always returned the money. Kept the pies. He'd repaired the Hendersons' furnace last winter in the middle of a power outage. Crawled through their crawl space with a flashlight and a prayer. No one saw him come or go. They just woke up warm. Fridays, Frank mowed the lawn at the corner house. Mrs. Abrams was 87, half blind, and her knees were shot. She still thought her husband was coming home from the war. Every Friday morning, she put out lemonade on the porch and a small American flag in the planter by the steps. Frank mowed while she napped. She never saw him. He never needed her to. Sundays were hardest. Frank visited the cemetery. He didn't bring flowers. He trimmed the hedges, polished the brass on the old plaques, and righted any flags that had fallen over. He did it before the sun rose, before families arrived in their Sunday best. He always paused the longest at the same headstone. SGT, Alan Reeves, Kia Mosul 2005. The man had died pulling Frank out of a burning Humvee. Frank had written his mother every Christmas since. Never told her why. At night, Frank returned home, poured 1 mug of tea, and sat in the same chair by the window. He turned on the AM radio, volume low. News. Weather. Occasionally a baseball game out of Cincinnati. Sometimes he'd stare at the bookshelf, where one photo frame stood alone. 10 men in dusty camo, all squinting into a desert sun. 4 of those men were gone now. 3 were missing. 1 lived in New Mexico and sent strange postcards with no return address. Beside the photo sat a shoebox. Inside, 2 Purple Hearts, a bronze star, and a medal he never explained. There was a letter, too, framed but face down, signed by a president whose name was always followed by division. Frank didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. He lived his service quietly. On the night after the diner incident, Frank added a new entry to his journal. Didn't go back. Don't plan to. Didn't sleep well. Not because of what she said, because of what no one said. Captain curled at his feet, purring like a machine left running. Outside, wind whispered through the pines. Rain ticked against the trailer roof like small reminders. He closed the journal and stared out the window. "You still with me, Captain?" he asked, not looking down. The cat flicked its tail. Elsewhere in town, a different kind of conversation was beginning. At the VFW, a younger vet had overheard a diner worker bragging about kicking some bum vet out. The description, flannel shirt, limp, army cap, fit only one man. Phone calls followed. In basements and garages, across folding tables and back porches, the question passed from mouth to mouth. They said, "What of Frank Dalton?" And quietly, like wind through long grass, something began to shift. The next Monday, a letter arrived in Frank's mailbox. It wasn't from a person. It was from a place, a private security firm in Virginia. The letterhead read, Blackridge Defense Group. The message was short. Mr. Dalton, we've been made aware of a recent incident. Please know your name still carries weight. More importantly, your example carries more. Respectfully, Dr. There was no return address. Frank read it once. Then again, he folded it and placed it under the shoebox, where a few other such letters rested like pressed leaves. That Friday, Frank woke before dawn. He trimmed Mrs. Abrams' hedges a little shorter, left the lemonade untouched. He stopped by the high school woodshop, fixed the wobble in the third lathe, left without speaking to anyone. He walked by the church, picked up 2 overturned trash bins, and nodded at the janitor who always waved. This time, the janitor stepped forward. "Hey, Frank," he said, voice tight. "Heard what happened? I wasn't there, but if I had been..." Frank didn't make him finish. He just gave a gentle nod and kept walking. That night, he opened his journal again. People noticing, not asking questions, just noticing. He paused, then added one more line. Still walking. Outside, a black SUV passed slowly down the road. Unmarked. Quiet. It didn't stop, but Frank saw it and nodded. Somewhere out beyond this small town, a ripple had started. And soon, the world would remember what one quiet man could still represent, just by keeping his rhythm. The town of Arbor Creek woke to a sound it hadn't heard before. It wasn't loud. No sirens. No helicopters. Just the low, deliberate hum of 3 matte black SUVs pulling into the gravel parking lot outside May's Diner. Engines idling low like wolves watching the tree line. The diner was already half full. Early risers sipped coffee, murmured over newspapers, and poked at overcooked eggs. The usual, but that hum, steady, purposeful, made forks stop midair. Conversations faltered. Heads turned toward the frosted glass windows. Then the doors opened, one after the other. 3 black vehicles. 9 men in tailored suits stepped out with quiet precision. They didn't speak. They didn't hurry. They moved like they'd done this before because they had. And at the center of them, walking calmly between the lines of chrome bumpers and oil stains, was a man the town hadn't seen in years. Colonel David Rourke. Tall, broad-shouldered, snow-white hair cropped to regulation. His dark suit didn't need a single insignia to declare who he was. His stride did that. His posture. His silence. He didn't wait at the door. He opened it. The bell above the frame jingled, and the room stopped. Inside May's Diner, everything froze. The waitress who had turned Frank Dalton away 2 days earlier, her name was Carly, stood behind the counter, polishing a mug that didn't need polishing. Her hand shook. Colonel Rourke didn't look at her. He looked instead at the corner booth. Frank's booth. The seat was empty. He walked slowly across the tile floor, every step measured, and pulled something from his jacket pocket. A worn photo, folded twice. He unfolded it. 10 men in camouflage. Sandblasted smiles. One of them, 5th from the left, was younger but unmistakable. Frank Dalton. Colonel Rourke laid the photo on the counter. Then he set something beside it. A bronze star. And then, without raising his voice, he spoke. This man sat in that booth every day for over a decade. Not for the food. Not for attention. Because it was routine. Because it was home. Yesterday, you turned him away for a cup of coffee. The words didn't echo. They settled, like a weight in the chest. A hush fell over the room. One by one, patrons looked away. Plates stopped clinking. The smell of hash browns and grease now seemed oddly misplaced. Too mundane for the gravity that had just entered the building. Carly stared, lips parted. I didn't know who he was, she whispered, voice dry. Colonel Rourke turned his eyes toward her for the first time. Now you do. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. But the steel in his voice was unmistakable. Then something remarkable happened. A man near the window, George Macon, the town's electrician, cleared his throat. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. Last winter, Frank brought extra blankets to our apartment building when the power went out. Knocked on every door. Never said a word. Just dropped them off. A woman by the jukebox stood slowly. He fixed my flat tire on the highway at night. I didn't even see where he went after. Another voice. And another. A teacher. A farmer. A nurse. Each story small on its own. But together, they form something profound. A mosaic of quiet service. A portrait in absence. Carly trembled. Her face had gone pale. She turned to the owner, Rick, who had just stepped out from the back. His apron still covered in flour. "I wasn't here that day," Rick said quickly. "I had no idea." Colonel Rourke didn't wait for excuses. "Then you'd better learn who's serving your customers. That man's blood is in soil you'll never walk." From the far corner of the diner, an older woman raised her hand. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "He's the one who puts the flags up at the cemetery every Memorial Day. Always before dawn. I've seen him do it. He thinks no one notices." A murmur rippled through the room. Someone had. Colonel Rourke's men didn't speak. They didn't need to. They stood in quiet formation near the entrance, watching, not guarding, witnessing. Rourke turned back to the counter. He pulled one more thing from his pocket. A small, rectangular card, black, with gold embossed lettering. He placed it gently beside the bronze star. It read, "When you're ready to understand what service really means, give us a call." He didn't press it forward. Just left it there. As the colonel turned to leave, one of the younger customers, early 20s, hoodie, phone in hand, raised his voice without thinking. "Is this some kind of show? Like, why make a big deal out of it now?" One of Rourke's men stepped forward slightly. Not threatening, just present. But it was the colonel who answered. "Because when good men go unseen long enough, we forget what they stood for. And then one day, we forget how to stand at all." He nodded once toward the room, a silent gesture of both farewell and judgment. Then he stepped outside into the sunlight. Outside, word had already spread. Locals stood across the street, some holding phones, some just watching with brows furrowed and shame lingering in their eyes. The SUVs didn't leave right away. One man, mid-40s, military build, stepped back into the diner. He walked calmly to the counter and looked Carly in the eye. "Next time," he said, not unkindly, "ask who you're talking to." Then he left. The vehicles pulled away without fanfare. The dust in their wake settled over May's diner like a reckoning. Inside the trailer on the edge of town, Frank Dalton sat with his journal open. He'd seen the convoy pass by through the sheer curtain at his window. He didn't flinch. Captain lay curled at his feet, unaware of the tremor just beginning in the town's foundation. Frank didn't write about it. Not yet. He sipped his tea and waited. Later that day, the convoy returned. 3 vehicles. Same men. This time, they parked outside Frank's trailer. But they didn't knock. They stood at attention, waiting. Frank set his mug down, reached for his cane, and opened the door. Colonel Rourke stepped forward. There was no salute. No introduction. Just an embrace. A brother's embrace. Firm, brief, filled with history. Then Rourke spoke. "We've got a situation, and we need your expertise." Frank didn't answer right away. He looked past Rourke to the younger men standing behind him. Alert, respectful, still learning. He looked down at his own hands, calloused, steady. Then back at Rourke. "Mission parameters?" he asked. Rourke smiled, his first of the day. "Rebuild, restore, remind." Frank nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work." The sun had dipped low when the vehicles drove off again, this time with Frank Dalton seated in the lead SUV. Back in the diner, Carly wiped down the counter. Her hand still shook. Beneath one of the plates she lifted, she found the black card. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, carefully, she slipped it into her pocket. That evening, the town of Arbor Creek sat quieter than usual. Not out of fear, but out of reflection. For once, people looked up from their phones. For once, they watched the flag outside the diner flutter and wondered who had kept it from ever touching the ground. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the country, a long-dormant mission had just been reactivated. Not for war, not for violence, but for reminding America that some heroes never stopped serving. They just learned to serve differently. The porch creaked under Frank Dalton's weight as he stepped outside. The screen door hissed closed behind him. Late afternoon light spilled across the gravel driveway, soft and gold, catching the faint dust kicked up by the three matte black SUVs parked silently out front. There were no sirens, no boot stomping, no commands, just presence. The kind of presence Frank hadn't felt in decades. One that didn't need explanation. It just was. Colonel David Rourke stood at the edge of the porch like a statue come to life. Hand behind his back, spine straight, gaze calm and steady. The men behind him didn't shift, didn't speak. They were waiting, but not impatiently. Frank said nothing at first. He let the silence stretch. Then he lowered himself onto the top step of the porch, slowly, deliberately, and rested his worn journal across one knee. The captain, watched cautiously from the doorway, tail flicking. Rourke stepped forward, not onto the porch, just to the edge. "We got a situation, Frank." Frank didn't blink. "Of course you do." Inside, the radio still hummed faintly, AM static rolling across baseball commentary out of St. Louis. A tea kettle hissed gently on the stove, left warm from earlier. Frank reached for a cigarette, paused, and put it back. He hadn't lit one in 15 years. That habit had gone quiet just like the rest of them. "How bad?" he asked. "Manageable, but delicate." Frank nodded slowly. "You need someone who still knows how to lead from the shadows." Rourke's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "I need someone who can show them how not to be seen and still be respected." There it was. The truth, laid bare like a mission briefing folder in a dim bunker. No rhetoric, no ceremony, just need and purpose. Frank leaned forward, elbows on knees. His prosthetic leg clicked softly as it adjusted against the wood step. "I haven't led anything since I fixed the Henderson boys' go-kart last summer." Rourke stepped onto the porch at last, lowered himself onto the other end of the top step, his polished shoes dusting against the pine boards. Two old men, sitting in the quiet heart of a changing world. "You led when you walked out of that diner without raising your voice." Frank didn't respond. Rourke continued. "You led when you didn't strike back, when you didn't demand, when you let silence do the talking." Frank looked down at his hands. The same hands that once disarmed landmines, carried bleeding brothers, held letters he never sent. "What's the objective?" he asked finally. Rourke didn't hesitate. "Rebuild, restore, remind." Frank let those words sit, like coals in a fire just beginning to catch. "Rebuild, restore, remind." He glanced sideways at Rourke. "Sounds like you're starting a church." "Close," Rourke replied. "We're starting something worth believing in." They sat in silence for a moment longer, watching as the sun bent low over the treetops. The youngest of Rourke's team approached cautiously and handed Frank a manila folder. No label, just worn edges and one paperclip. Frank opened it. Inside were photos, not of war, not of enemies, but of places. A vandalized war memorial in Arkansas, a shuttered VFW hall overtaken by weeds in Kansas, a veteran support center in Ohio that now doubled as a pawn shop, a funeral, flag draped, where only two people stood graveside. At the back of the folder, a list. Names, ages, status, unacknowledged, forgotten, at risk. Frank exhaled slowly. "I see the mission. It's not a battlefield," Rourke said softly, "but it is sacred ground." Frank nodded, eyes tracing each face in the photos. Faces that mirrored his. Lives built from discipline, sacrifice, silence. Then buried in the noise of the new world. "What do you need me to do?" Rourke met his eyes. "Be seen." Quietly. Frank chuckled. Hell of a paradox. The best kind. That night, Frank didn't sleep. He sat by the window, the journal open on the table, untouched. Captain purred at his feet. The radio played an old Sinatra track. It was a very good year. Frank didn't hum along, but he remembered every word. He looked at the shoebox beneath the bed and pulled it out. For the first time in years, he opened it. The medals were still there, untarnished, but he wasn't looking for them. He reached beneath them for something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully. A worn, folded piece of paper. A note, handwritten, dated 20 years ago. It read, "If you're reading this, Frank, then they've come for you again. Don't say no, not because they need you, but because the world still needs people like you to say yes." It was signed, Captain R.G. Evans. Kia, Kandahar. Frank folded it and began to pack. The next morning, the town of Arbor Creek woke to another surprise. Frank Dalton, wearing his old field jacket and a clean press shirt, stood outside May's diner. The same diner he had walked out of in silence. The same place he had been told he wasn't welcome. This time he didn't go in. He stood on the sidewalk, not blocking, not protesting, just present. He nodded at those who passed, said nothing, and then, without a word, walked across the street to a folding table where one of Rourke's men now sat. They were setting up something called the Remembrance Initiative. No fanfare, just a clipboard, a coffee urn, and a sign. Tell us about someone who served, so we can remember them properly. Frank sat down behind the table and began taking names. By noon, the line stretched around the corner. That afternoon, Carly, the waitress, walked out of the diner. She held a small piece of paper in her hand. Her eyes were red. Her apron was gone. She walked up to the table, stood in front of Frank, didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, she placed the paper down. My grandfather, she said softly. Korea. We never talked about it. He passed last year. Frank looked at the name. Then he picked up a pen. Thank you, he said. Not sarcastic. Not cold. Just honest. She nodded and walked away. By evening, over 200 names had been logged. The stories ranged from Normandy to Fallujah. Some were typed, some scribbled on napkins. One was written on the back of a child's drawing. Each one was read aloud by a rotating group of volunteers standing beside Frank. No microphones, just voices. Frank watched and listened, and for the first time in years, his shoulders eased. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it was shared. Back home, Frank poured himself a cup of tea. The convoy was gone, but tomorrow it would be in another town, and the next. Each time, it would set up the same folding table, the same sign, the same clipboard, but now it had a face. His. He opened his journal and wrote, Mission accepted. Then beneath that added, Remind them not of war, but of worth. He smiled. Captain blinked up at him from the floor, then curled into his usual spot. Frank leaned back, looked out into the dark, and whispered, Still walking, Captain. Still needed. It started with the quiet removal of a name from the diner's schedule. No public statement. No big confrontation. Just an erased entry on a clipboard in the back kitchen of May's diner. Carly wasn't fired in shame, at least not formally. She'd asked to step down, they said. Not the right fit, was how Rick, the owner, worded it. But everyone in Arbor Creek knew what had happened. No one talked about it directly. But the way people avoided her name in conversation, the way eyes shifted when veterans walked in, that said more than gossip ever could. The day after the folding table had been taken down, May's diner opened with a fresh coat of paint on the front door, a new pot of chrysanthemums by the steps, and a small framed photo on the wall near the register. Frank Dalton, 1972. In uniform, standing tall, unsmiling but proud. Below it, some heroes eat breakfast here. On Monday, the mayor's office held a closed meeting. By Wednesday, the high school band was practicing the national anthem in the school parking lot. By Friday, it was official. Arbor Creek declared the second Friday of every November Frank Dalton Day. Not because he asked for it, because someone finally remembered why they should have. Frank didn't attend the town hall vote. He was in the woodshop classroom at Arbor Creek High. Mr. Keene, the longtime shop teacher, had thrown out his back a few days earlier. Frank hadn't been asked to step in, but he had anyway. The young men, mostly juniors and seniors, some barely hanging on to graduation, gathered around the saw tables with guarded curiosity. They'd heard about him. Some had seen the diner footage. Most had seen the SUVs. But what hooked them was this. Frank didn't speak much. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just showed them how to play in a crooked board. Always with the grain. He told a red-haired boy named Jesse. Even when it's stubborn. Jesse didn't answer, but his hand slowed. His cuts grew straighter. By the end of the week, 3 students who rarely showed up for anything started arriving 5 minutes early. One brought coffee. Another brought sandpaper. The third just said, "You gonna be here tomorrow, Mr. Dalton?" Frank looked up from the bench press. "If I wasn't, who would finish teaching you how not to ruin a dovetail joint?" The boy smiled. It was the first time he had in weeks. Word spread, but not like wildfire. More like rain seeping into dry earth. Slow, quiet, needed. The librarian at the county archives called and asked Frank if he'd be willing to consult on organizing the veteran history files. She said they were a mess. Said they wanted someone who understood more than just filing systems. Frank said yes. The manager of the hardware store left a set of keys on Frank's front step. No note, just a set of keys with a tag. Anytime. The town's police chief, newer, younger, and observant, started requiring every new officer to read an essay Frank once wrote for a defense journal in the 80s. The title? Command Without Echo. Leadership When No One's Looking. Veterans began showing up, first in ones and twos, then by the handful. Some came just to shake his hand and leave. Others stayed and talked long after sundown. They brought coffee, tools, letters they'd never sent, grief they'd never spoken aloud. Frank never judged. He just listened. Sometimes they sat in silence. Other times they wept. Once, a Marine vet who hadn't spoken in public in years leaned forward and asked, "What do you do when the fight never leaves your head?" Frank replied, "You stop fighting it. You make a walking partner, but you don't let it lead." One afternoon, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. No sender, no markings, just Department of Defense watermark and an old seal. Frank opened it at the kitchen table. Inside, a letter of reinstatement to advisory status. Top clearance. Active consultation role. His name, typed in bold. His history, acknowledged in official language. Frank read it once, then folded it, slipped it beneath the shoebox. Didn't speak a word. He didn't need titles anymore. His footsteps were louder now than any rank. The next day, a local reporter tried to interview him. Frank declined. "Let the story stay with the town," he said. "They're the ones finishing it." That Sunday, Frank walked his usual 2 miles before sunrise. This time, though, he wasn't alone. 3 high school boys from his shop class joined him. One carried a small American flag. Frank didn't ask them to. They didn't announce it. They just showed up. When they reached the town cemetery, Frank handed them the hammer and stakes. "One flag at every veteran's grave," he said, "before the sun crests the hill." They nodded and got to work. By the time dawn broke, over 80 flags fluttered in the morning wind. Later that morning, a police cruiser pulled up slowly beside Frank's driveway. Officer Michelle Ramirez, young, sharp, and carrying the kind of humility that can't be taught, stepped out. She didn't come in uniform that day. Just jeans and a faded department sweatshirt. She handed Frank a folder. Inside, a new training program. Community Recognition and Veteran Respect Protocol. Frank flipped through it, then closed the folder. "Don't do this for me," he said. Ramirez met his eyes. "We're doing it because of you, but it's for everyone else." He gave a slow nod. "Then you're on the right track." By mid-November, Arbor Creek had changed. It didn't become perfect. It didn't become famous, but it became aware. A new bench appeared outside the town library with a small bronze plate. "In honor of those who walked among us without needing recognition." The diner started offering free coffee for veterans every Friday. No sign, just quiet understanding. And on a Thursday evening, the principal of the high school announced a new scholarship. The Frank Dalton Award for Quiet Leadership. No fanfare, just a letter mailed to Frank's trailer. He read it, smiled, and poured a cup of tea. That winter, Frank's steps grew steadier. Not because the road got easier, but because he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The town didn't just see him, they began seeing each other. The boy from the shop class helped an older man across an icy parking lot. A teenager offered his jacket to a stranger waiting at the bus stop. A mother took her daughter to the cemetery and explained what the flags meant. None of these acts made headlines, but they were the ripple. Frank didn't start with speeches. He started it by showing up, by not yelling when wronged, by standing and letting silence carry truth. That February, someone replaced the American flag outside his trailer with a new one, stitched, folded, and respectfully placed in his mailbox. No name, no note, just respect. Frank raised it that morning, and when it caught the wind, it snapped clean and proud, just like he always had. Back inside, Captain the Cat hopped up on the table beside the journal. Frank opened it, wrote, "The Ripple turned title today." Then, below that, "Turns out, All you have to do is keep walking. Eventually, they walk with you. The wind was up early that morning. Not loud, not violent, just steady. It moved through Arbor Creek like a whisper from an older time, rustling through pine branches, tugging gently at porch flags, carrying the scent of early coffee and last night's cold rain. Frank Dalton stepped out of his trailer, just as he always did. Same flannel shirt, same cap pulled low, same boots, scuffed and silent on the gravel. But something was different. It wasn't in him. It was around him. The 2-mile walk into town had once been a lonely ritual, a rhythm of habit, more than hope. But not anymore. Now, when Frank passed the old gas station, Mike Henderson, the retired Army mechanic turned clerk, was already standing out front with 2 coffees. He raised one in a silent toast. Frank nodded. At the bakery, the owner's daughter, maybe 9 or 10, leaned over the windowsill and gave a small salute. She'd done it every morning since Veterans Week. Frank still wasn't sure who taught her. Didn't matter. At the crosswalk near Main Street, a delivery truck slowed. Not because it had to, but because it wanted to. The driver leaned out the window. "Morning, Mr. Dalton. Need a lift?" Frank shook his head, smiled. "Walk keeps the rust off." The driver laughed. Frank kept moving. Left, right, prosthetic clicking softly with each step. A metronome of resilience. As he reached the edge of town, a boy on a bike skidded to a stop. He looked about 12. Scraped knees. Hoodie too big. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Didn't say a word. Just handed it to Frank and pedaled off. Frank unfolded it slowly. Crayon. Spelling errors. No punctuation. "Thank you for reminding us what service looks like." Frank folded it again, gently, as if it were metal, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The cemetery was quiet, as it always was before 8 a.m. No birds yet. No lawn crew. Just rows and rows of stones. Some new, some worn, some barely legible. Frank moved without hurry. Past Sergeant Will Kimmel's grave. Past the Reeves brothers. Past his own squad mate from Kandahar, buried with no family but the flag Frank had placed himself. He stopped at the back row. There, next to a small stone marked simply S. Taylor, 1968 to 2006 inch. The flag was missing. Frank knelt. His knee clicked faintly against the frost-covered grass. From his coat, he pulled a small bundle, wooden dowel, tightly folded flag. He planted it, pressed the stake down with the weight of both hands, then sat back on his heels. Let the silence settle. "Still got work to do?" he murmured. Back in town, the ripple had become something else entirely. A current. The new high school principal stopped by Frank's trailer weekly now, not to drop off paperwork, but to sit on the porch and ask about discipline, consistency, and how to reach kids who don't speak out loud. The mayor's office had added a veteran liaison desk, inspired by Frank's methods. 1 part listening, 1 part action, no grandstanding allowed. And the local radio station, AM 620, had started reading names every Friday morning. Veterans, deceased or living. No rank mentioned, just names and dates. They called it the Still Standing List. Frank never asked for it, but he listened every Friday with his tea and Captain curled up beside him. One afternoon, a young police officer knocked on his door. She wasn't in uniform. Jeans, jacket, nervous smile. "Sir, I wanted to say thank you." Frank opened the screen door. She continued, "I was in the academy last year. They gave us a file to read about a man who stood still and changed everything." She swallowed. "That was you, right?" Frank tilted his head. "Might have been. We have to write a reflection paper after training. I quoted you." Frank raised a brow. "What did you write?" She hesitated, then reached into her back pocket and handed him the paper. One paragraph was highlighted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. He just stood there, steady as a flagpole. And it made me realize maybe authority doesn't come from shouting. Maybe it comes from knowing when not to speak. Frank handed the paper back. "Sounds like you learned the right lesson." She smiled softer now. "You think I'll make a good officer?" "Depends." "On what?" Frank didn't smile. "On who you stop, and how you choose to treat them." That night, Frank opened a shoebox for what he thought might be the last time. He didn't touch the medals. Didn't even look at the folded reinstatement letter. He pulled out one thing. A simple, wrinkled note card. From years ago, written by a medic in Iraq. Now long gone. Dalton, you were the calm in every storm. If I don't make it home, carry that forward for me. Frank stared at it, then slipped it into the front cover of his journal. Legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you carried, until someone else could pick it up. The next morning, Arbor Creek had a frost. Everything shimmered. Car roofs, grass blades, flagpoles. Frank stepped outside into the crisp air, coffee in hand. The flag above his trailer flapped high and proud. Someone had left something beneath the mailbox. A small wooden box. Handmade. Sanded smooth. Inside were carved names. About 24. No note. Just initials. And one line etched into the lid. For the man who made us walk taller. Frank ran his hand across the names. He didn't know them all. But he didn't have to. The town didn't build a statue. There were no parades. No CNN stories or viral hashtags. But the streets got quieter when veterans walked by. Doors opened sooner. People listened longer. And every Sunday, the flags at the cemetery stood straighter, planted by hands that now understood why. Not because Frank told them, but because he'd shown them. One final scene. Frank walking his 2-mile route. Same boots. Same stride. Same silence. A truck slows to let him cross. The driver nods. A young boy on the porch salutes. Frank returns the gesture, 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. A breeze catches the edge of his coat. He keeps walking. At the cemetery gate, he pauses, looks out over the stones, then bends, plants a new flag with both hands, and smiles to himself. Still got work to do. The camera pans up to the faded American flag waving above his porch, crisp against the late autumn sky. Then cuts to black. Voiceover. Some heroes never stop serving. They just serve differently. Though the battlefield is far behind him, the soldier continues to serve, not through rank or command, but through steady presence, quiet compassion, and a daily example of dignified kindness. In a world that often forgets and rushes past, the silence of dignity speaks louder than any shout. You don't need a title to make an impact. You just need to keep showing up. A life lesson for older adults, inspired by Frank Dalton. At a time in life when many believe their role is finished, Frank Dalton's story arrives like a warm whisper. Service never ends with age. It simply changes form. Frank is no longer a commanding officer. He no longer stands at a podium or holds a battle map. But he still leads by doing things like picking up trash on the sidewalk, fixing a neighbor kid's broken go-kart, planting flags at the cemetery every morning. These small, quiet acts remind us of something our generation, those who have lived through war, hardship, and loss, know deeply. Steady kindness is the highest form of honor. 1. Aging is not the end. It's a new form of service. Modern society often makes older adults feel forgotten, as if their time of contributing has passed. But Frank shows us, when you hold onto your principles, you remain a compass for your entire community. You don't need a microphone. You don't need social media. You just need to keep the promise to yourself. Be useful every day. 2. Don't underestimate the power of presence. Frank doesn't chant slogans. He doesn't ask to be recognized. He simply shows up consistently, quietly, at the right place and time. And that alone changed an entire town. In real life, older adults sometimes wonder, do I still matter? The answer is, you make an impact by how you live each day. By the way a store clerk sees you smile. By how a child watches you stop to pick up a fallen flag. 3. Respect isn't earned through power. It's earned through character. Frank didn't need titles to be respected. His steadiness, lack of complaint, and willingness to listen made people lower their voices in his presence. At 70, you may not run anymore, but you can still be the one your grandkids turn to and ask, how do I live a good life? Be the hand that gently holds someone grieving without saying a word. Be the quiet example of discipline, gentleness, and silent responsibility. Whether you live in a small town or a big city, here are 3 simple things you can do like Frank. Show up regularly. Take a morning walk. Sit at the same cafe. Plant flowers in your yard. People will notice and find peace in your steady presence. Listen without judgment. Sometimes a young person just needs someone who will sit and listen. Not advise, not criticize. Just listen like Frank does with fellow veterans. Do small things with a big heart. Straighten a flag. Hold a door open. Say, "Thank you, sweetheart," with sincerity. That's how you continue building this country. Not with bricks, but with dignity. The flag outside Frank's porch never comes down. And if you, retired without titles, continue to live upright, work hard, and show kindness, then to the generation watching, you are that flag. And the world still needs you. Every single day. Because some people never stop serving, they just serve in a different way. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.